I'm going to be in the way of that. Okay, we've got some pictures. I feel I'm rather competing with a beautiful Saturday evening here in Perugia at the last gasp of the conference. So thanks to you for coming anyway. Let's see how far we get with it. I'm basically going to tell you my story as one journalist who found myself in the middle of a big story. And in a way, when I kicked off that story, you know, I knew it was huge. It was certainly huge to me, and I knew that the little snapshot that I was looking at was part of a global picture. And so, although this is a story of a massive kleptocracy with banks in the spotlight and politicians on the ropes, and the global financial system, you know, under scrutiny, for me, it began here down on the ground, an underreported tragedy in a barely remarked area of the world. It's the deforestation of Borneo. And it happened to be the place where I grew up. When I left, it was a fabulous forest as a small girl. And when I came back, having sort of become a journalist in 2006, I flew over the same part of the region and over 1,000 miles of palm plantation. And of course, the issues, I don't need to tell all of you, you know, the issues with palm oil plantation. It's not just the effect on our climate, carbon sinks turning into carbon, you know, exploding carbon emitters, but also a huge human rights tragedy, massive people trafficking, slavery down on these palm plantations. I went up to see some of the native people in whose name all this so-called modernization had taken place. And it was very obvious that they'd benefited not one jot from all this so-called development. I began to ask questions. You know, what was driving all this unnecessary tragedy, this loss of enormous biodiversity, one of the natural treasures on our planet? It was very clear what was causing it. The driving force was corruption. You know, that's not unique. You see Taib Mahmood as the little guy in the middle. He's one of the least known billionaires in the world, one of the richest men, and he has accumulated the wealth of 35 years of controlling one of the richest countries on the planet and taking most of that economy into his own pocket. No one was reporting it. You know, that Malaysia is a quiet country and it hides its dirty baggage and it keeps its media extremely controlled. And so therefore there was very little reporting, although I was getting all the whispering very quickly about how many billions this man was sitting on. And I'd already discovered, you know, the intense problems being faced by local people who were having all their land rights trashed and were living under daily intimidation from, I mean, you know, if any of you have ever come across a logging gang moving into your little village, you understand just what a terrifying and miserable existence they were facing. So I took this on. And I started looking at it more deeply, and it became obvious to me very quickly that you know, there's no point deforesting your country unless you can get the money out. And you know, Taib was doing what he was doing because he was being facilitated by an army of banks, accountants, lawyers. Offshore industry, of course, was all facilitating this. And indeed, you had the companies who were putting up the investment for this kind of logging. The Sam Ling, the biggest logging company in Sarawak, which is now actually at the center of a web of timber corruption globally, they were first put in business by Caterpillar, who came down with them on the ground and mapped out, you know, how many trucks would be needed to get this out, and basically upfronted the vehicles and took their payment when the trees were down. I started doing what people couldn't do locally, which was to map Taib's corruption. I started looking at all his foreign property portfolios, and he had billions invested in mansions, office blocks, all around the Western world, all around the developed world. He even owned, and still does own, the FBI headquarters in Seattle. And this caused quite a storm in Sarawak. You know, I started this internet site and I put it all out there, and I reckoned that, you know, this was just at the cusp of internet. certainly in this part of the world. We're talking about 2010. And I realized that there was a vibrant interest in the internet. All the urban areas were logged up, and also, there was a fairly free internet at that stage compared to the mainstream media, which was heavily controlled. So I started just putting these stories out, and immediately realized, I'm actually quite an old-fashioned television journalist, and I wasn't quite sure what an impact it would have, and I was soon getting thousands and then tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands of hits because of the style of journalism that I'd taken up. There was a great deal, I could see from the online debate, which being in Malaysia was in English, I could see that there was a great deal of concern within the country about the deforestation issues. But it was unfocused, and I felt I could bring my professional background as a journalist to this issue, and I started putting fact-based journalism focused and bringing all the documentation to bear, so that my target, the chief minister by that time, was very much my cites, couldn't really deny the stories that I was putting out. And I combined that with a very old-fashioned technology. We set up a little radio station in the indigenous Iban language and Malay. And these started, the shortwave radios, which was the way I got around the very controlling local laws, were being distributed by Christian groups and opposition groups around the villages. And it's been a really fantastic experience. The radio station's been going for 5 years, and actually getting people ringing in with their problems, talking to each other, getting the issues out. It became very transformative, and we changed the narrative. By those means. Both, this was targeted at Malaysia and at the local people, but it did have the knock-on effect of changing the narrative on Malaysia for outside journalists and then commentators. Type had a horrible election result. He was used to getting sort of 90% plus, and he went down to 55%. The opposition was right up there in the 40s, and that was after the cheating. So we really felt we'd made some progress back there in 2011. 2012, I moved on to the other guy standing there next to Taib, who's Musa Aman, and that's the other rainforest state of Malaysian Borneo. And he was doing exactly the same thing, and he had been getting away with it, virtually no publicity. Wills and Kate went off to do PR for the Sabah Borneo rainforest, which annoyed me immensely, because this guy has also been making huge amounts of money personally out of timber kickbacks. And actually, throughout most of 2012, I focused on him and managed to trace over $100 million dollars in timber kickbacks that he channeled through banks such as UBS and prior to that HSBC into his Zurich UBS bank account. And in fact, there's a prosecution going on at the moment in Switzerland at last against UBS for processing Musa Aman's money. But the two guys were still there. Taib got bumped upstairs to governorship, which gave him a sort of level of immunity. Musa is still there, and his brother is the foreign minister of Malaysia. And I started to realize that, of course, it didn't matter. I mean, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission had made a huge dossier on both these guys. Najib Razak, who's in the middle there, the prime minister, was not going to move these guys, because he was up to it too, wasn't he? And so I started looking at him. And there was a particular fund that was of, more suspicious than anything else in Malaysia at that time, which was the One Malaysia Development Fund. And this was supposed to be driving development, and billions of dollars had been raised, except nobody could see where the money was going. If you see, this was one of the big projects for which $3 billion was raised just a month before the election in 2013 in an enormous hurry. And here we are 2 years after that. Not much of that $3 billion seems to have been spent on the business district. So the question was, what was this a big slush fund, as everyone thought and everyone was gossiping about? I didn't actually think of this, as my area at all. I was focusing as a, Sarawakian-born foreigner on one particular issue, and I wasn't expecting to raise my eyes beyond into federal politics or federal issues in any way. But 1MDB's first partner as a joint venture partner for all this borrowed money was a mysterious company called Petrosaudi, which sounds as if it should be absolutely huge and like the picture on its website. But once you started looking at it, you wondered why 1MDB had invested $1 billion of borrowed money into Petrosaudi. I was whispered to by sources that I developed that this was actually Najib's flush fund, and these guys were just Arab playboys who were acting as a front. So I started digging, and I found there was there was one of the many sons of the present king of Saudi Arabia was a shareholder, and then a sort of playboy character called Tariq Abeid who had no background, So how come they were getting $1 billion invested in them? There was another issue, which was that Petrosaudi's only other business deal after having received that money, for which there was nothing was accounted for. They started investing in Sarawak. They bought up one of the chief minister's major companies called UBG. And so therefore I started looking at it and wondering, why this very generous buyout of the chief minister of Sarawak's company just before the election. It was all just a bit smelly, so I gently wrote about it. And indeed, the chap who was becoming much more prominent behind it, the guy in the white hat, with his favorite party girl, Paris Hilton, to whom he used to pay $1 million to join him on these occasions. Jolo was the supposed brains behind 1MDB, and everybody knew that he was the big consultant behind 1MDB. And, he was becoming fantastically rich. The guy was only 26. And he in the years after the original 1MDB deals, he started to splash money like anything. And particularly interesting, he had a chunk of the company, UBG in Sarawak. He'd bought into that just a few months before UBG had been bought out by 1MDB. And, the chief advisor to 1MDB buys into a company that then gets bought out by 1MDB. It was all looking a little bit dodgy. So I had my eye on that. And I also, the other big story that was really gaining momentum at that time in 2013 was FLOM, that's First Lady of Malaysia. She's a girl who makes Imelda look like an amateur when it comes to spending. And Rosmer was definitely the pants in that household. That was the gossip. And she was buying diamonds like nobody's business, and she couldn't resist flaunting the whole lot. So there were, this was the background to, this, when I actually first got going with 1MDB. I'm supposed to be concentrating on indigenous rights in the Borneo rainforest, what's left of it. And I get a little thing through my inbox, Christmas 2013, just before this Wall Street movie is launched, to say, hey, did you know that Rosmer's been promoting this to be watched by all school children in Malaysia as a warning against bad, immoral living? And you might be interested to know that her son's the producer. So that was interesting. I looked up a little bit more about this movie and realized that it was $100 million movie. And all the Hollywood press were touting, Reza Aziz as being the guy behind the funding of it. Reza Aziz is the son of Rosmer and Najib, and frankly, there was they're not supposed to have money, this family, and Reza had a pretty undistinguished career in his I think he was in his early 30s by then. And as I went through all the PR pictures, you can see there's Reza second from the left, from the left looking at it. You've got Jolo again. Jolo was in all the promotion pictures. There's Leo, there's Martin Scorsese, and there were all these pictures. And Jolo kept popping up, and I was starting to say, well, there's some questions to be asked here. When Leo won the Golden Globe Award that January, he got up and said, I have to thank Joe and Reza for taking a chance on the movie. So by which time I decided it was, this was good for a story. So I wrote my story on my blog, Wall Street Greed, Malaysian Money, or something like that I called it, and I asked questions. I just said, how come? How come this wealth? How come this expenditure? How come the pervasive presence of Joe Low and the thanks to Joe Low? is Jolo financing this movie? How did he get to be so rich? And is it connected to his known involvement with Reza's daddy's development fund, 1MDB? And I got a lot of reaction from that. I got a lot of legal letters from Reza's company. And I also got a lot of information coming back from Hollywood, people who were involved in the film. And they told me that, hey, Reza's got a lot more money, personal money than that. I'd already identified a big, very expensive penthouse flat in New York. Well, I learned that he had a Hollywood mansion in Beverly Hills that he was secretly the owner of. So I located it and climbed up a ladder that was handy against a tree. And then I broke in because it was being rebuilt. And got this story on, and again, this put them on the spot a little bit because it's beautiful sound, isn't it? This put them on a spot a bit because this wasn't just investment in a, in a business venture, in a movie, which was hard enough to put, to justify anyway, because Reza's a young guy, he's never been in movies before. Who's gonna invest in, in a movie by him, but this was a personal possession. It was $30 million worth of Hollywood mansion he shouldn't have had. Oh, and my goodness, did I get more legal letters after that? Well, that focused my mind. By this time, of course, the Malaysian media were onto the story. The New York Times were doing more on this guy. I mean, Jolo was just a perfect, character as a backdrop for all these stories because, he was just so bloody rich. That's his yacht. He was involved in every kind of $1 million party. He was lavishing money around Hollywood. I mean, the stories were just wonderful to write up. He used to take Leo on weekends, and he used to pay him $500,000 a weekend just to come and join him in Vegas, where he used to lay on the jets, the entertainment. I daren't go into the full details of the entertainment. The gambling chips were paid for. They had a ball. They did a double dip New Year. So 2012, Joe took them all to Sydney Harbour, and they all had a yacht, Sydney Harbour, fireworks display New Year. And then they all went on 2 private jumbos back to Vegas and double dipped and had New Year there as well, all on his ticket. And, Jolo, he was only 27, 28, and he'd started off by saying that he wasn't rich himself. He was just very good at sucking up to all the friends he'd been to school with at Harrow. He'd done 2 years at Harrow, and then he'd gone to Wharton. And he was good at sucking up to them and getting them to invest things. And he called himself the concierge for their parties. So that all those amazing sort of stories that were coming out in the media about how he'd bought, endless bottles of Cristal, to treat the entire nightclub, that was somebody else he was fronting for. That was the original story. And then he changed his story. He started talking about how he was from a 3rd-generation billionaire family. So again, it was kind of like, what's going on here? He's changing his story. So, of course, I went to town pointing this out. The other thing that Jolo had started saying by now, and I'm talking about the early 2014, I'd been harassing them all over, this movie business. He started saying, look, I haven't had anything to do with 1MDB since 2009. I did a bit of advice when they set it up, and then I've had nothing to do. And 1MDB said the same thing, nothing to do, nothing to do. So, I just kept looking and digging and knocked up against a court judgment online in London. This is Clares, and it's part of the biggest, most expensive hotel chain in London. And through this court ruling, I discovered that Jolo had put in $1 billion bid to buy it. Back in 2011, that's 2 years after he said he hadn't had anything to do with 1MDB. But in fact, 1MDB had backed his bid and had put up money, put up a few million to try and get this bid rolling. He didn't succeed in it. And there was another very interesting connection from that because there was another company that was the second phase of 1MDB's investment, which was a major sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi called Abar. And a bar, it comes up, I'll talk about it later, but a bar was really the next, after Petrosaudi had raised so many questions, and that business venture, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but it just went, evaporated. And there was massive criticism because the money had gone. They started doing business with a bar instead, which was a very good front. I mean, a major sovereign wealth fund, part of the International Petroleum Investment Company at that time, although it's all gone tits up now because of all of this corruption. But I noted that a bar and Jolo were being backed by 1MDB to buy Claridge's hotels. So I had Jolo and 1MDB on a big fat lie now, which is, I'm sure you're all journalists, you know how useful that is. They had said that they hadn't worked together for 2 years, and they clearly had. And I then identified other business deals that involved a bar and Jolo. There was a purchase of coastal oil for $2.3 billion in Canada, for example. So there was stuff going on, and I just knew by that stage that this could be a huge story. And then I learned that there was a whistleblower, and that's Xavier, who you can see there with his wife in Thailand with their new baby. And I was asking around everyone for further stuff on 1MDB, and someone said, well, we've been sent this bizarre document. Somebody wants to sell this story, and to cut a very long story short, I wheedled my way to see Xavier Justo, and over 6 months, he was tantalizing me with this unbelievable stash of information. He had used to work as a director. He was one of the most senior figures in Petrosaudi. He hadn't been involved in the 1MDB deal directly, but had come to the company and taken over shortly after it, and then fallen out with it. He'd found that all his old friends who had been running Petrosaudi had turned into the most obnoxious high rollers, and he said they were ruined by this extraordinary influx of cash that each of them had got. And of course that was because they'd got such enormous kickbacks from 1MDB. And when I eventually got my hands on this cache of material, 3 million emails. I mean, it was data is not my thing. But I poured through it, and it was all there. And I remember the first document that really jumped out at me was a transfer that was made out of that first the first billion, of $700 million to a company called Goodstar. I said, what's this about, And Xavier said, oh, well, Goodstar belongs to Jolo. So 700 million out of that 1 billion had gone to a company that belonged to Jolo. And I went through the documentation, and it was possible to show that Jolo was indeed the controller of that company from this email data that I got. So by that time I knew, this was huge. But it was quite difficult. I had to, I was just one little blog, which had got some kind of recognition in Malaysia, and this was a massive global story. The money went through Coots Bank. So I started working with other newspapers. I gave this to the Times, actually, Sunday Times. And I started shoving it under the nose of the FBI, the fraud squad, the Swiss authorities, anyone I could, to try and sort of, use the tools that I had to make sure this story didn't get squashed. And it was touch and go for a while, actually. In that data, you can see the lineup. You've got Jolo again. Next to him, that's the Saudi prince who was fronting it. There's Najib, his wife, Skipper Child, and the other, that's the second from the end, is Tariq Abeid. Neither Tariq or the prince had much money to themselves until they got the most enormous kickbacks after that diversion of the 700 million. This is just before they did the deal on one of the biggest yachts in the world, called the Tatouche, just off the coast of Monaco. And, it was just a scoop photo. There they all were. They all were denying that they'd had anything to do with each other, and there they are, all lined up. Jolo, clearly the mastermind of this deal. And for people who are interested in flowcharts and things, White and Case was the lawyer that the very large law firm in London that helped them through their whole offshore maneuver of, setting up endless subsidiary companies that they could shunt, and they came up with this wonderful excuse that the excuse for hiving off the 700 million was that Petrosaudi was supposedly lending 700 million to its own subsidiary before the joint venture was made, and the guys who were running the joint venture agreed to pay it. One MDB agreed to pay back that 700 million for reasons that were perfectly, impossible to understand. All this was pushed through, of course, because Najib Razak was in control. He had total control over this development fund. It was hidden. When Patrick Marney was the guy behind Petrosaudi. He was the brains. They all had to have flash girls, so that's Lindsay Lohan, in case you didn't recognize her. I certainly didn't. So he was caught very unhappy about that picture. He's made it copyright, and he keeps trying to tell me I can't show it to anybody. That's Patrick Marney, got a nice house in Notting Hill. It's all part of their kickbacks from acting as a front, as Patrick so accurately put it when he wrote an email saying to Joe Lowe that Petrosaudi would be very happy to help out with their particular scheme. The DOJ has done a good, lowdown on exactly the money that was that 700 million, and then later hundreds of millions more were taken out of that particular scheme between Petrosaudi and 1MDB, and they bought, with it, Joe Lowe bought hotel chains, a jet. A few mansions for himself, It was just the most extraordinary squander of money. And then came the lashback, of course. Xavier got set up. He was living in Thailand on the beach, and Marnie found out exactly where he was. They got together with the Thai authorities. They whacked him in jail, called him, accused him of having tried to extortion and stealing confidential information. Oh, and of course, distorting the information, so it wasn't true, but trying to use it to extort. So, and they got him to confess. They shoved him behind bars and basically said, "We'll let you out as long as you sign this confession. We've really got to discredit that Clare Rucastle woman. So if you just sign that, and then we'll let you out." And of course, once he'd signed it, he was screwed, because then they could give him a big long sentence. Xavier's just out now. We got him out after heavy campaigning, but he was in that Thai jail for 18 months. So that's another side of this story. And of course, meanwhile, the whole propaganda machine got into real full sway to discredit me. And I was. There were TV documentaries about how awful I was in Malaysia. I became extremely famous in Malaysia, no thanks to my blog, but thanks to the counterattack against me. In the end, my blog was banned. A warrant was produced for my arrest for dissemination of false information and for obstructing parliamentary democracy. They tried to put me on the terrorist alert list at Interpol, which was rejected. So it all became, a massive, massive story in Malaysia, while I'm just trying to bat away with the information. And indeed, as you who are journalists will know, once you start stirring up the story, that's when you start, people come forward, So if you go in aggressively on a story, people contact you. And the next interesting bit of contact I had was from someone who had a bit of background on the second stage, the Abar stage of the 1MDB adventure. Abar, you can see them signing up here. You've got, on the left, you've got Mohammed al-Husseini, who was the chief executive, and then in his great flowing, do look at his very, very formal flowing Arab dress, he's the chairman, Kadam al-Khabaisi. Then you've got the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi flown in for this there. He hasn't got a clue what's going on, actually, but he thought it seemed like a good idea. Then the Prime Minister, and then the chairman of 1MDB, and Cheryl Halmy, the completely useless and totally compliant CEO of 1MDB there, who signed off everything knowing that it was a total scam. So I was told that Kadam al-Khabaisi had been getting big checks from Goodstar. Well, that was interesting, isn't it? How come Kadam al-Khabaisi? So I did a story on that. Oh yes, this is behind the scenes at that signing. Altogether, using its joint venture with Abar, 1MDB borrowed $6.5 billion, and the money disappeared. Nobody was accounting for this stuff. I mean, there was just chaos. There was, there was nothing to show for it and no accounts. So what was going on? Well, the person who told me a bit about Kadam told me about his other life. This was Kadam when he's off duty. He's a nightclub addict. He had masses of money. He was spending it on opening a nightclub empire, the Hakkasan nightclub empire that was opened just after the first of the two joint ventures that Abar underwent with 1MDB. Hakkasan is now the biggest nightclub empire in Vegas, expanding globally, worth billions. Where did the money come from? Bought himself the inevitable Beverly Hills mansion, took over the funding of Topaz, the third largest yacht in the world, utilized by Sheikh Mansour. Now, the reason I knew all this was because that's the sort of nightclub he enjoyed going to if he didn't own them. The reason I knew I could write about all this was because I was given a good chunk of his bank statements from a trust that he'd opened with Edmond de Rothschild Bank in Luxembourg. He was given payments of $500 million from a very odd-sounding company, Blackstone Asia Real Estate Partners Limited, which was an offshore BVI company. I thought, oh my God, don't tell me Blackstone's involved in all of this. No, Blackstone wasn't involved in it. Blackstone was one of many offshore companies that were posing as, subsidiaries of known concerns through which 1MDB's money was being channeled by Joe Lowe. You can see here, this was a little graph I did from the DOJ's very comprehensive report when they sequestered $1 billion worth of property from 1MDB-related thefts last July. And you can see Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs was the bank that raised all the money with a bar. And I'd been chasing them too. I mean, through all of this time, I'd been raising questions about the various banks that seemed to be getting involved with 1MDB, in highly unaccounted for deals. And I was having fun with attacking all these banks. Because there was enough information out there to ask the questions, the mainstream media are reluctant sometimes, and I know why, because you always get millions of legal letters back, but they don't take you to court if they're very valid questions, and Goldman Sachs is supposed to be very litigious, hadn't taken me to court, and you can see why. They'd been up to their necks in it. I mean, their chief of Southeast Asia has now been asked to leave the bank and is cooperating with the authorities in America. They sent this entire loan to a funny little bank called Fulcrum Bank, which just happened to be owned by a bar. Chairman just happened to be the CEO of a bar, and the guy behind him was, of course, Kadam. And then that money just happened to go to BSI Bank, which I had already exposed as being involved in receiving money from Goodstar. So it all came in, and then you see the money going to Standard Chartered in Singapore and a Blackstone Asia Real Estate Partners account. And then you can see 470 million from there went on to Kadam's Vasco Trust, and from there into all the expenditures I mentioned earlier. You can see above that 66 million went to Mohammed Al-Husseini. That was his kickback. Through American banks, the Bank of Texas and a Bank of America in Texas, and various other people who had facilitated this from 1MDB. In Malaysia at this time, of course, this story had become, the story in Malaysia, and people were galvanizing. You were getting street demonstrations. The opposition were going wild. Najib was trying to play cool. He was the chairman officially of the advisory committee on 1MDB. What people didn't know was that he was also, there'd been a secret amendment to the Mem and Arts of 1MDB, and he had been called Section 117, which gave him personally the only authority to sign anything off financially on 1MDB. He was running it, micromanaging it, but pretending to be part of a distant advisory board. And Goldman Sachs were great. When they put out the bonds, which were largely private issue, they talked about a robust three-tier structure for 1MDB, free from political influence. And in fact, as the chief executive explained, the board was completely ignored in all of this, and they had to do whatever Najib said, because he was the only guy under that secret section who could sign anything. So I don't think at this early stage Najib realized that all these uncomfortable details would come out. So he launched various task forces into 1MDB, which a large section of the civil service and the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, the police were and the central bank very enthusiastically got to work, digging out what was going on. And these gobsmacking details were coming to light and being leaked to me. So I started to get, of course, more information about the inside of all this. And we're talking about, May, June, July of 2015. And as every sort of, telltale kind of smoking gun detail came out, it just made, it got hotter and hotter and harder to try and explain away why all this money was missing from 1MDB. Until eventually I got the real killer story, which was that the central bank had been tracing some of this money and had seen that $700 million, $681 million to be precise, had come in a couple of payments into the Prime Minister's personal AM bank account in KL. Just 3 days after 1MDB had raised $3 billion. And in fact, where did the money come from? That was the question. And the timing was all very interesting because it was just a week before he called the election. So you could ask these questions. Isn't it strange that, all this money came just after 1MDB has raised all that money that we still don't know where it went, and just before the election, which, was flooded with cash, as everyone could see. Again, helpfully, the FBI and DOJ have now, traced the money completely, and you can see that that's exactly what happened. Goldman Sachs raised it. They sent it to BSI Bank again, which was completely, people have gone to prison at BSI Bank, and in fact, it's been shut down, as you know, because of this scandal. So they were funneling the money through. It went to through a few offshore bogus funds into Falcon Bank again, and then into Najib's account. Slam dunk, you'd have thought. Again, there was another local fund called SRC International, which again raised 4 billion ringgit locally from a pension fund. And we started to get details about how that money was being channeled. And this was all being locally traced by the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission. There was an awful lot of really good work going at a local level, and being leaked to me very helpfully. Into the Prime Minister's bank account through, again, the usual offshore system. Well, this was via Julius Baer in Hong Kong, back into that Blackstone Asia, $170 million straight from the pension fund into the Prime Minister's account. So, I mean, it's shocking stuff, and, you'd have hoped that Najib would have stood aside or been kicked out. But instead, my website was banned, and he conducted a coup against his own country. He sacked his deputy, he sacked all the senior members of his cabinet, he sacked the Attorney General who'd been about to bring an arrest warrant for him. And the following day after that coup, I was sent a copy of the arrest warrant. It was quite a story, but I satisfied myself that that's what it was, and that's exactly what it had been. The warrant for the arrest of the Prime Minister, and I published that. And unfortunately, that's the guy who sent that warrant to me. He was kidnapped about 6 weeks later, and was found buried in a barrel of cement in some swampland. And there's some local gangsters who are now up in court for that, but one wonders what the motive, nobody's really gone in very satisfactorily into the motive, although something's been come up with. Malaysia, the 500,000 people went onto the street in Malaysia. It was a very big issue. I'm gonna have to wrap pretty soon, as I think the bells are telling me I've come. But again, they then tried to close down the whole scandal. And to say that, you know, Malaysia, you know, that the new Attorney General came in and said that everything had been investigated. And he held up the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission's papers and said, look at this huge report, this dossier, he said. And you can see, we've looked at it, there's nothing wrong. Nothing's gone wrong, he said, and no money's gone to the Prime Minister, and this has all been false news by a Sarawak report. And some very handy photographer took a picture of those papers, which, when you zoom in on them, show the exact opposite, that the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission had detailed exactly how the money had gone into the Prime Minister's account. So it was a complete, you know, shoot yourself in the foot moment. And again, that was a wonderful story to broadcast. And then I just kept getting more leaks about where that money and how it had been spent. You know, $1 million ringgit, that's like, you know, $750,000 on anti-aging treatments, luxury goods, credit cards on holiday. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on jewels in an Italian jewelry shop in Sardinia where they'd been on holiday. You know, Malaysians are boiling over all this, and the story's out there. You know, what can they do? I just kept on, you know. I'd been going after BSI Bank's head for some time. He's now obviously sitting in Singapore facing charges. I went after the Goldman guy who turned out to have a bogus doctorate. You know, I was just having enormous fun, you know, highlighting all the banks that had got caught up in this ghastly event. And until the DOJ came in like, you know, cowboys on a white horse, and sustained, you know, absolutely to the letter, backed up everything I'd been saying, rather as a voice in the wilderness, but backed up by that stage by some pretty big hitters like the Wall Street Journal. I'd given them the story about the bank accounts, and ever since then they've been, you know, leading on this story too. So by July of last year, the DOJ had substantiated our point. But has he gone? No, he's still there. He still reckons he can put this away. He's still abusing power like mad. This was another story I was proud of. It was another leak to me. Shortly after, you know, he's been trying to close down and shut up this story. He did a deal with a Chinese construction company to build a railway for double the price that it had originally been estimated at. So instead of it being 30 billion, they did a deal to build it for 60 billion. And guess what? I was leaked the detail, which shows how they had minutely hidden all the repayments due on 1MDB in that contract. So he's aligned himself now with China, who's, you know, really flexing its muscles in Malaysia now. And we live on a nice edge. What is going to happen here? You know, he's cracked down, he's put people in jail, he's brought in emergency legislation so that anybody who criticizes him is in danger of being shoved in jail. And he's going after the media. Anybody who reruns any of my material is in danger of being shut down and hauled before the courts. So the question is, you know, Malaysia's living in fear now. Will the international investigations that are still ongoing, will the pending criminal investigations flush out Najib in the end? And that's where we stand on this story right now. The total that has gone from 1MDB is 7.1 billion, and over $1 billion of that went into Najib's own account directly. So that's a snapshot of a story, but I think it's enough for you to deal with for now, and I don't know if any of you got any questions. Thanks. Did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I've been following your investigation for a while, and I have 3 little questions. First, how do you find the experience of cooperating with investigative authorities, DOJ, and in other countries as a journalist?
Sorry, with which authorities?
DOJ and other
okay.
authorities, Swiss authorities. And the second question is, I probably missed, how did you initially got access to these 3 million emails? Like, what was your first step towards getting data? And last one, White & Case is such a prominent law firm, so I wonder how they reacted to this.
You mean White & Case?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, there have been so many big names involved in this, and it's a real sense of the impunity that all these banks and major law firms, you know, they've all got away with this. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that 1MDB is just one example of a you know, worldwide system of this kind of theft that has just been so successfully carrying on thanks to, you know, our offshore finance system and all the rest, and really very poor regulation by global regulators, that they just weren't expecting, you know, anybody to catch up with them, really. You know, White & Case have never come back to me and said, don't say that we did this, because it's obvious they did. You know, they'll have to look at their systems. And in fact, the guy who led the White & Case team on the original Petro-Saudi deal, the day after the deal, he resigned and went over and became a director of Petro-Saudi. And in that capacity, he then hired White & Case for several other $100 million deals. In fact, I heard from a third person that Petro-Saudi at one point was White & Case's best customer. They made $1 million out of the Petro-Saudi 1MDB deal. And they're putting it all into legal, you know, and they're just sitting there being prepared to believe everything they're told, convincing or not. I got the details from the Savio Giusto data. I had Petro-Saudi's emails. It was Petro-Saudi's database that he had acquired. You know, and so that's been a massive source of information on the deal. And, you know, they've tried to accuse me very publicly and repeatedly. And, you know, they always write to newspapers who try to cover the story and say, this mad woman, you know, she's taken our data and then she's forged it and doctored it and changed it. And what was a Snow White deal, you know, is in fact being misrepresented by this woman we dare not sue. Well, you know, so that's how they're dealing with me. But you know, we've got the inside, and it's not often that you get the absolute guts on a dirty deal. And it's one reason why I really hope that 1MDB will be used, you know, as a stick to beat, you know, the whole offshore system with. Because that's what, you know, this is a perfect example how politically powerful people are using offshore systems to rip off their countries, and of course other people too. You know, whereas the Panama Papers and so forth, you can have a lot of data. This is the story behind the data that we need to think about. And your first question was, well, journalists, as you well know, are treated with enormous suspicion by any kind of, you know, official authority. So I sympathize with them. I know they don't want to be caught up with me, and I interface with them as little as possible. I act just like any other witness. If I've got some information, I send it to them. And I don't expect them to tell me anything. I wouldn't want them to, because it would compromise them. And I'm just extremely grateful that they, you know, that they did take up this story eventually and have thrown, you know, the book at it. And they've done an amazing job. And you know, so I'm just letting them get on with it. Likewise, the Swiss. I mean, you know, none of them, you know, they know they're going to be up against the biggest lawyers in the world. I mean, all that money's sloshing out there, and all these guys have been hiring huge legal, you know, support. And the last thing any of the official investigations want is accusations that they've had any, you know, inappropriate interface with a journalist. So, thanks for sticking it out.
Yeah, hi, no, great presentation. Thank you very much. I just have one question regarding to what also the lady said already. You at the end, you show us how China is now going to save the fund, and that nothing basically happens to the lawyers and everything. So why do you do such stories? For example, you uncover the story, now China is going to save the Malaysian Prime Minister, he's still there. The invasions, okay, are ongoing, so what do you expect will come out at the end, like realistic expectation? And why do you do it when you see that then political forces, major forces like China are coming in and save the culprit, so to speak?
Well, they're not going to get away with it if I have anything to do with it. We've exposed the fact, we've exposed their dirty little deal for a start. So we've embarrassed China on that front. Everyone in Malaysia knows what they're doing. Everyone in Malaysia is absolutely furious that Najib's playing games with China. China's been extracting its price very heavily. It's building cities now in sensitive areas in Malaysia. It's, you know, it's flexing its muscles. It's sending its military out into the Malacca Straits. You know, in the end, this has to be solved by the Malaysians themselves, who have the vestiges of a democracy. There is an election coming. There is a coalition now of just about everybody against Najib. He will, of course, attempt to abuse his power, use the levers that enable him to rig elections, pay for elections, steal more money to bribe in elections. We'll have to see. He should hold the election. And you have, you know, many people, all the big figures in Malaysia now are against him, from within his own party, and of course he's put the opposition leader in jail, but people from within his own party are now supporting the release of the opposition leader. There is still hope that, having gone through this education in democracy and this information experience of the likes that Malaysia's never seen. I mean, they always knew there was corruption. Now they've seen it, and you see a great education taking place, you know, in the commentaries online. Let's see. I mean, let's see whether he's going to get away with this. Criminal proceedings are going to be brought now. I mean, we've only seen the first part of it. We've seen the civil seizures by the United States. Very soon, we're going to see, we've seen criminal proceedings against bankers by Singapore, who are dragging their feet because it's their neighbor. It's all very awkward for them politically. But Switzerland and America will take their time, but we're going to see criminal proceedings. And the Prime Minister, in my book, he should be on that list. But definitely Jolo and other people who were involved in this will be on will have warrants for their arrest issued, and that should have an effect on the political landscape again in Malaysia. So that's, and why do I do it? Because, you know, otherwise I don't do anything, and something, you know, in front of something terrible that was going on.
So, thanks a lot for your speech, and I'm quite sure to have found some more infos about other companies, not just Goldman Sachs, like, for example, KPMG or Ernst Young and Deloitte in your investigation. Can you give us some more infos about that companies, please? Thanks a lot.
Yes. The auditors have been absolutely, again, dreadful facilitators of all this. And, you know, certainly I and the many other critics, I mean, I'm not the only person now, of course, who's been questioning the whole structure of 1MDB and the performance of the auditors. I mean, 3 of the big 4 have gone through 1MDB. And the reason they've had to retire so many is because, you know, it's become, you know, first it was Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young gave up very early on. I think they could see what was happening and didn't sign off the original accounts, actually. So then KPMG took over, and they did actually. They did sign off a whole lot of the accounts, but when they, you know, they just couldn't account for the money that was taken out of the initial Petrosaudi deal. I mean, I haven't gone into the details of that. It was just too much to go into. But you know, they pretended they made a big profit and that it was being hidden in the Cayman Islands. You know, there was no money. It had been stolen. We could see that it had been stolen. And KPMG gave up and said, look, you know, unless you can prove you've got the money in the Cayman Islands, we're not going to pass the accounts. And so you went for years without the accounts being passed. So then Deloitte's took over, and they did a kind of ridiculous round-tripping exercise for Deloitte's, which Deloitte chose to believe, and they passed the accounts for 2012 and 2013. Now, after the DOJ, you know, sort of court action, Deloitte's kind of announced that they were going to have to rescind those accounts, and they were apologizing, and they resigned from their position. So the, you know, what it shows is that in all these cases, you know, if this story hadn't come out, all these accountancy firms, all these banks, they were just letting it all through. And Deutsche Bank was another, you know, I mean, Deutsche Bank, BSI, Falcon Bank, ANZ, JP Morgan, Julius Baer, Edmund de Rothschild, Goldman Sachs, UBS, Standard Chartered. Most of those have already been punished and fined. Coutts, of course, that was where the original 700 million went to. All these banks allowed these things to happen, and they're all being investigated now. But the story was almost dead. I mean, 2014, which was when I sort of thought the Wolf of Wall Street business was a bit suspicious, the story was nearly over officially. I mean, you know, they could so easily have got away with it. So,
you're written a book about this.
I'm,
What do you think to write?
I am writing a book. Well, I'll send you a copy. I'm in the middle of it now, and I'll be doing another chat this evening. I've done the draft. I'm in a bit of a race with the Wall Street Journal because they're writing a book, and they got a simply massive advance on their book. So the only thing I can do is get mine out first. No, not yet. No. But I'll find someone in the end. Yeah. Yeah, no, there's been a sort of personal adventure behind it. You know, just. I can't imagine that. Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm being told that it's time for the next seating. So look, thanks all of you late on a Saturday on the last day for sticking it out. Get the money out. And, you know, Taib was doing what he was doing because he was being facilitated by an army of banks, accountants, lawyers, offshore industry, of course, was all facilitating this. And indeed, you had the companies who were putting up the investment for this kind of logging. The Sam Ling, the biggest logging company in Sarawak, which is now actually at the center of a web of timber corruption globally, they were first put in business by Caterpillar, who came down with them on the ground and mapped out, you know, how many trucks would be needed to get this out, and basically upfronted the vehicles and took their payment when the trees were down. I started doing what people couldn't do locally, which was to map Taib's corruption. I started looking at all his foreign property portfolios, and he had billions invested in mansions, office blocks, all around the Western world, all around the developed world. He even owned, and still does own, the FBI headquarters in Seattle. And this caused quite a storm in Sarawak. You know, I started this internet site, and I put it all out there, and I reckon that, you know, this was just at the cusp of internet, certainly in this part of the world. We're talking about 2010. And I realized that there was a vibrant interest in the internet. All the urban areas were logged up, and also, you know, there was a fairly free internet at that stage compared to the mainstream media, which was heavily controlled. So I started just putting these stories out, and immediately realized, I mean, I'm actually quite an old-fashioned television journalist, and he went down to 55%. The opposition was right up there in the 40s, and that was after the cheating. So we really felt we'd made some progress back there in 2011. 2012, I moved on to the other guy standing there next to Taib, who's Musa Aman, and that's the other rainforest state of Malaysia and Borneo. And he was doing exactly the same thing, and he had been getting away with it, virtually no publicity. Wills and Kate went off to you know, do PR for the Sabah Borneo rainforest, which annoyed me immensely, because this guy has also been making huge amounts of money personally out of timber kickbacks. And actually, throughout most of 2012, I focused on him and managed to trace over $100 million dollars in timber kickbacks that he channeled through banks such as UBS and prior to that HSBC into his Zurich UBS bank account. And in fact, there's a prosecution going on at the moment in Switzerland at last against UBS for processing Musa Aman's money. But the two guys were still there. Taib got bumped upstairs to governorship, which gave him a sort of level of immunity. Musa is still there, and his brother is the foreign minister of Malaysia. And I started to realize that, of course, it didn't matter. I mean, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission had made a huge dossier on both these guys. Najib Razak, who's in the middle there, the Prime Minister, was not going to move these guys because he was up to it too, wasn't he? And so I started looking at him, and there was a particular fund that was of, particularly down on these palm plantations. I went up to see some of the native people in whose name all this so-called modernization had taken place. And it was very obvious that they'd benefited not one jot from all this so-called development. I began to ask questions. You know, what was driving all this unnecessary tragedy, this loss of enormous biodiversity, one of the natural treasures on our planet. It was very clear what was causing it. The driving force was corruption. That's not unique. You see Taib Mahmood as the little guy in the middle. He's one of the least known billionaires in the world, one of the richest men, and he has accumulated the wealth of 35 years of controlling one of the richest countries on the planet and taking most of that economy into his own pocket. No one was reporting it. That Malaysia is a quiet country and it hides its dirty baggage and it keeps its media extremely controlled. And so therefore there was very little reporting, although I was getting all the whispering very quickly about how many billions this man was sitting on. And I'd already discovered, the intense problems being faced by local people who were having all their land rights trashed and were living under daily intimidation from, if any of you have ever come across a logging gang moving into your little village, you understand just what a terrifying and miserable existence they were facing. So I took this on. And I started looking at it more deeply, and it became obvious to me very quickly that, there's no point deforesting your country unless you can get... I'm going to be in the way of that. Okay, we've got some pictures. I feel I'm rather competing with a beautiful Saturday evening here in Perugia at the last gasp of the conference, so thanks to you for coming anyway. Let's see how far we get with it. I'm basically going to tell you my story as one journalist who found myself in the middle of a big story. And in a way, when I kicked off that story, I knew it was huge. It was certainly huge to me, and I knew that the little snapshot that I was looking at was part of a global picture. And so although this is a story of a massive kleptocracy with banks in the spotlight and politicians on the ropes, and the global financial system, under scrutiny. For me, it began here down on the ground, an underreported tragedy in a barely remarked area of the world. It's the deforestation of Borneo, and it happened to be the place where I grew up. When I left, it was a fabulous forest as a small girl. And when I came back, having sort of become a journalist in 2006, I flew over the same part of the region and over 1,000 miles of palm plantation. And of course, the issues, I don't need to tell all of you, the issues with palm oil plantation. It's not just the effect on our climate, carbon sinks turning into exploding carbon emitters, but also a huge human rights tragedy, massive people trafficking, slavery. And I wasn't quite sure what an impact it would have. And I was soon getting thousands and then tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands of hits because of the style of journalism that I'd taken up. There was a great deal, I could see from the online debate, which being in Malaysia was in English, I could see that there was a great deal of concern within the country about the deforestation issues, but it was unfocused, and I felt I could bring my professional background as a journalist to this issue, and I started putting fact-based journalism focused and bringing all the documentation to bear, so that my target, the chief minister by that time, was very much on my cites, couldn't really deny the stories that I was putting out. And I combined that with a very old-fashioned technology. We set up a little radio station in the indigenous Iban language and Malay, And these started, the shortwave radios, which was the way I got around the very controlling local laws, were being distributed by Christian groups and opposition groups around the villages. And it's been a really fantastic experience. The radio station's been going for 5 years, and you know, actually getting people ringing in with their problems, talking to each other, getting the issues out. It became very transformative, and we changed the narrative by those means. Both, I mean, this was targeted at Malaysia and at the local people, but it did have the knock-on effect of changing the narrative on Malaysia for outside journalists and then you know, commentators. Type had a horrible election result. He was used to getting sort of 90% plus.